August 15, 1969, Malibu Canyon. Danny McKenzie had been Steve McQueen's shadow for 3 years, his double, his friend, his keeper of secrets. That's why when McQueen's Porsche pulled over for 2 flower-crowned girls hitchhiking on Pacific Coast Highway, Mac was the one who got out first, the one who saw what happened in those headlights.
That's exactly why the studio executives chose him to clean up their biggest star's mess. 2 hippie girls, flower crowns wilted, blood on their tie-dyed shirts, McQueen's Mustang idling in the alley behind the Whiskey A Go-Go. "You never saw this," the studio fixer whispered, sliding Frank the keys. "You never saw him." What Frank did in the next 40 minutes saved Steve McQueen's career and destroyed his own. The papers ran the story with Frank's photo, calling him McQueen. The real king of cool disappeared to his ranch, clean as a whistle. For 50 years, Frank kept his mouth shut. Until yesterday, when 2 women walked into his shop asking about their mothers, the girls who never made it home that night. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mac's hands hadn't stopped shaking since she walked out of his garage 3 days ago. The surviving girl, Claire Hoffman, she'd called herself now, though back in '69 she'd been Claire Morrison, had left him with a business card and 48 hours to decide. "I'm not looking for revenge, Danny," she'd said, her voice carrying the weight of 5 decades. "I'm looking for the truth, and if you won't give it to me, I'll find another way." Now Mac stood in the pre-dawn darkness of his garage, watching the empty street through oil-stained windows. Bakersfield was still asleep, but Mac knew better than to trust the quiet. He'd been running on 3 hours of sleep and bad coffee since Tuesday, jumping at every car that slowed, every shadow that moved wrong. The bell above his door chimed. Mac's hand instinctively moved to the 38 he kept under the register. "We're closed," he called out, not turning around. "Not for me, you're not." The voice hit him like a punch to the gut. Smooth, confident, unmistakable, even after all these years. Mac spun around to find a man in an expensive suit standing in his doorway, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of smile that belonged in boardrooms where people's lives were bought and sold. Harold Nile, McQueen's former agent, the man who'd orchestrated Mac's exile. "Hello, Danny. You're looking well for a dead man walking." Mac's grip tightened on the gun. "What do you want, Harold?" "Same thing I've always wanted. Your continued discretion." Neil stepped into the garage, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the concrete. "Though I hear that's become something of a challenge lately. I haven't said anything. Not yet." Nail's eyes swept the garage, taking in the vintage Mustang Mac was restoring, the faded Hollywood memorabilia on the walls, the life of a man who'd been erased from history. "But we both know why I'm here. Claire Hoffman has been very busy. Documentary films, Danny? Very popular these days, very permanent." Mac pulled the 38 from behind the register, not quite pointing it at Neil, but making sure it was visible. "Steve's been dead 43 years. What's it matter now?" "Oh, Danny." Neil's laugh was soft, almost paternal. "You still don't understand, do you? You think this was ever just about Steve?" The words hung in the air like exhaust fumes. Mac had spent 54 years believing he'd sacrificed everything to protect his friend's career, but the look in Neil's eyes suggested something much larger, much darker. "See, Steve made the mistake of thinking he could control the narrative," Neil continued, moving closer. "Started asking questions about that night, about who the girls really were, about why certain people were so eager to make the problem disappear." Mac's blood ran cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that mesothelioma is a very convenient diagnosis, especially when administered through alternative medicine in a Mexican clinic." Neil's smile never wavered. Steve thought he was untouchable, the king of cool. But kings fall, Danny. They always fall. The garage felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in. Mac had convinced himself that McQueen's death was random, cancer, bad luck, the price of a hard life. But Harold Neil had just shattered 54 years of carefully constructed reality. "You killed him. Protected our investment. Just like we're going to protect it now." Neil reached into his jacket, and Mac raised the 38, finger on the trigger. But instead of a weapon, Niall pulled out a manila envelope. Claire Hoffman has a daughter, granddaughter too. They live in Portland, beautiful family. Would hate for anything to happen to them. Mac's hand trembled. The same game they'd played in 1969 when they'd convinced him to take the fall. Threaten the innocent to control the guilty. You have until Sunday, Danny. That's when she's planning to release her little documentary. Make sure that doesn't happen and everyone stays safe. Try to play hero. Neil shrugged. Well, we both know how that story ends. The bell chimed again as Neil headed for the door. Oh, and Danny? Don't bother running. We've been watching you for 54 years. You really think we'd stop now? Mac was alone again, the .38 heavy in his shaking hands. Through the windows, Bakersfield was waking up. Normal people heading to normal jobs, living normal lives that hadn't been bought and paid for with blood and silence. He looked at the envelope Neil had left on his workbench. Inside would be photos of Claire's family, addresses, schedules, everything he needed to know that the threat was real. For 54 years, Mac had believed his sacrifice had meant something, that protecting Steve McQueen's secret had served some greater good. But if Harold Neil was telling the truth, if they'd murdered the king of cool himself, then Mac had been living a lie since 1969. The question now was whether he had the courage to stop living it. Drop a comment below and let me know, do you think Mac should protect Claire's family or expose the truth? And if you're hooked on this story, make sure you're following, because tomorrow we dive deep into that deadly night in Malibu Canyon that started it all. Mac stood frozen for a full minute after Neil disappeared, the .38 still trembling in his grip. The envelope sat on his workbench like a cancer, waiting to metastasize into his carefully ordered world. Outside, the sun was painting Bakersfield's skyline in shades of amber and rust, the same colors that had bled across Malibu Canyon that night in 1969 when everything went to hell. He set the gun down and walked to the small kitchenette in the back corner of his garage, muscle memory guiding him through the ritual of making coffee. The beans were cheap, but he ground them fresh every morning, one of the few luxuries he allowed himself. The familiar routine steadied his hands, the rich aroma cutting through the lingering scent of expensive cologne and implied violence that Niall had left behind. The coffee maker gurgled to life, and Mac caught his reflection in its chrome surface, distorted, fragmented, like everything else in his life. 58 years old, with hands that bore the permanent stains of motor oil and regret. His hair had gone gray early, stress accelerating what genetics had started. Sometimes he wondered what he might have looked like if he'd stayed in Hollywood, if he'd kept working with Steve, if that night had never happened. The bell chimed again, softer this time. Mac's shoulders tensed until he heard a familiar voice. Mac, you in there? Back here, Rosa. Rosa Delgado pushed through the garage's front office, carrying 2 steaming cups from the diner across the street. She was 43, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a life spent working for everything she had. Her daughter Sophia was in her first year at UC Davis, studying engineering, the first in their family to go to college. Thought you might need this, Rosa said, setting one of the cups next to his coffee maker. You look like hell. Mac managed to smile. Rosa had been bringing him coffee most mornings for the past 3 years, ever since her husband died and she'd started working double shifts at the diner. It had become their unspoken ritual, 10 minutes of easy conversation before the day's weight settled on both their shoulders. Bad night, he said, accepting the cup. Her coffee was better than his. She had a way with the diner's ancient machine that bordered on magic. The nightmares again? Mac nodded. He'd told her about the dreams, sanitized versions that blamed generic war trauma rather than the specific horror of watching a 19-year-old girl die because powerful men needed a scapegoat. Rosa had her own ghosts. She understood the weight of carrying things you couldn't put down. You ever think about leaving? She asked, settling onto the worn stool beside his workbench. I mean really leaving, not just talking about it. The question hit closer than she could know. Where would I go? Anywhere. Mexico, maybe. Start fresh. She sipped her coffee, studying his face. Sophia keeps asking when I'm going to introduce her properly to the mysterious car guy. She thinks you're some kind of reformed outlaw. Smart girl. Too smart for her own good sometimes. Rosa's expression grew serious. Mac, whatever's going on with you these past few days, if you're in some kind of trouble, I'm not. The lie came automatically, practiced from decades of use. Just old ghosts acting up. Rosa didn't look convinced, but she'd learned not to push. That was what Mac valued most about their friendship, the comfortable spaces between words, the understanding that some stories weren't ready to be told. The morning light was stronger now, streaming through the garage's high windows and illuminating the shrine Mac didn't realize he'd built over the years. Movie posters from films he'd worked on, back when his name appeared in credits. A framed photo of him and McQueen on the set of Bullet, both of them grinning like they owned the world. A shelf of car magazines featuring vehicles he'd modified for chase scenes. 15 years of hiding, and he'd still surrounded himself with reminders of what he'd lost. I should get going, Rosa said, standing and smoothing her uniform. Mrs. Patterson wants her usual breakfast ready before 7, and God help me if her eggs aren't perfect. She paused at the workbench, her eyes falling on the envelope Neil had left behind. Mac tensed, but Rosa simply traced one finger along its edge. Mail from Hollywood? She asked lightly. Something like that. Huh. She headed for the door, then stopped. Mac, whatever's in that envelope, you don't have to face it alone. You know that, right? After she left, Mac stared at the envelope for a long time. Inside were photographs he knew. Claire's daughter teaching at an elementary school in Portland. Her granddaughter, maybe 8 years old, walking to school with a bright pink backpack. Normal people living normal lives, unaware they'd become pawns in a game that started before they were born. Mac opened the envelope. The first photograph showed a woman who looked exactly like Claire had at 25. The resemblance was so perfect it took Mac's breath away. The same delicate bone structure, the same wild auburn curls that caught light like spun copper. For a moment, 54 years collapsed into nothing, and he was back in that Malibu canyon watching Claire Morrison stumble out of McQueen's Porsche, her flower child dress torn, her eyes wide with terror. But this woman was older, calmer. The photograph showed her standing in front of an elementary school, a welcome back students banner visible behind her. She wore a simple blue dress and carried a canvas bag stuffed with papers, a teacher's bag. Her smile was gentle, unguarded, nothing like the haunted expression her mother had carried that night in '69. Mac's hands shook as he flipped to the next photo. The granddaughter, just as Neil had promised, 8 or 9 years old, walking down a tree-lined sidewalk with that bright pink backpack bouncing against her small shoulders. She had Claire's curls, but darker, almost black, and she was laughing at something out of frame. Probably a friend or her mother walking beside her, living their ordinary Portland lives without any idea they were being watched, cataloged, turned into leverage. The third photograph made Mac's blood freeze. Claire's daughter, Jennifer, according to the neat handwriting on the back, unlocking the front door of a modest craftsman house. But in the background, barely visible in the shadow of a maple tree, stood a figure with a telephoto lens. The photographer had been close enough to capture her house key, the small mole on her left hand, the exact address printed on the mailbox, 847 Elm Street, Portland. Or Mac dropped the photographs like they were on fire. His coffee cup hit the concrete floor and shattered, sending brown liquid splashing across his boots. The sound echoed in the garage's emptiness, sharp and final. They'd found Claire's family. They'd been watching them, studying their routines, building a profile just like they'd done to Mac himself all these years. The same people who'd murdered Steve McQueen were now holding 2 innocent lives over his head, demanding he choose between his conscience and their safety. The phone rang. Mac stared at the rotary phone mounted on his wall, a relic from the '70s that he'd never bothered to replace. It had to be 8 o'clock in the morning, too early for customers, too early for solicitors. The only people who called this number were Rosa and his parole officer, and Rosa had just left. The ringing continued, insistent, demanding. On the 4th ring, Mac picked up. Danny Mackenzie. The voice was Claire's, but older, wearier. After all these years, I finally found you. Mac's throat went dry. Claire? I told you I'd find another way. She sounded tired, like she hadn't slept in days. The documentary's finished, Danny. It airs this Sunday on Channel 7. Unless what? Unless you're willing to tell the truth, on camera, about what really happened that night. Max sank onto the stool Rosa had vacated, the scattered photographs at his feet like pieces of a shattered mirror. You don't understand. They'll kill you. They'll kill your daughter, your granddaughter. I know about the photographs, Danny. They sent me a copy yesterday. Claire's laugh was bitter. Same playbook after 54 years. Threaten the innocent to control the guilty. Then you know I can't help you. Can't? Or won't? Her voice sharpened. That night in Malibu Canyon, you made a choice to protect Steve McQueen's reputation. You sacrificed your career, your family, your entire life. But Steve's dead, Danny. He's been dead for 43 years. Who are you protecting now? The question hung in the air like exhaust fumes. Mac looked around his garage, at the shrine to his lost life, at the comfortable prison he'd built around his guilt. For 54 years, he'd told himself the sacrifice had meaning, that keeping Steve's secret served some greater good. But if Neil was telling the truth, if they'd murdered Steve to keep him quiet about that night, then Mac had been living a lie since 1969. I need time, he said finally. Time's up, Danny. The documentary airs in 4 days with or without you. The only question is whether the world learns the truth from both of us or just from me. The line went dead. Mac hung up the phone and stared at the photographs scattered across his garage floor. Claire's daughter, Claire's granddaughter. 2 lives that would be forfeit if he chose conscience over compliance. But how many other lives had been destroyed by his silence? How many other secrets were buried beneath the weight of his cowardice? For 54 years, Mac had convinced himself that silence was a form of protection. Now he was beginning to understand it had always been a form of violence. The question was whether he finally had the courage to stop being violent. The coffee stains spread across the concrete like blood, dark and accusing. Mac knelt among the scattered photographs, his knees protesting against the cold floor. Each image felt radioactive. Claire's daughter laughing with her students, the granddaughter skipping down that tree-lined street, the shadow of their stalker lurking behind suburban normalcy. He tried to convince himself this was just another game of chicken, like the old days when studio fixers would rattle their sabers to keep actors in line. But Harold Neal's eyes had held something colder than threats. They'd held certainty. Max swept the photos into a pile and shoved them back in the envelope, as if containing them might somehow undo their existence. His hands moved automatically to the phone, dialing a number he hadn't called in 15 years. Bakersfield Sheriff's Department. Deputy Martinez, please. He's not in yet. Can I take a message? Mac hung up. What would he say anyway? That Hollywood agents were threatening Portland school teachers? That a decades-old cover-up was unraveling? Luis Martinez had been good to him over the years, checking in occasionally, treating him like a reformed man rather than a broken one. But this was beyond local law enforcement. The garage door rattled open, and Mac's heart hammered against his ribs. But it was just wind, the morning breeze stirring up dust devils in the alley behind his shop. Still, he found himself checking the locks, testing the security cameras he'd installed 3 years ago after a break-in. You really think we'd stop watching? Neil's words echoed in his head. Mac walked to his workbench and pulled out a legal pad, the same kind he'd used to sketch stunt sequences back in Hollywood. He wrote Jennifer Hoffman, 847 Elms T, Portland at the top, then stared at the blank page. What was his play here? He couldn't warn them without revealing his own involvement, couldn't run without abandoning them to Harold's mercy. The bell chimed again, and Mac nearly jumped out of his skin. Mac, you okay in there? Tommy Valdez stood in the doorway, holding a greasy carburetor and wearing the concerned expression of someone who'd known Mac long enough to read his moods. Tommy ran the parts shop 2 blocks over, a decent guy who'd never asked questions about Mac's past, never pushed for details about why a man with Hollywood money lived like he was 1 paycheck from eviction. Fine, Mac said, sliding the legal pad into a drawer. What do you got there? Customer brought this in yesterday. Says it's from a '69 Mustang, but something feels off. Tommy set the carburetor on Mac's workbench, his movements careful and deliberate. Thought maybe you could take a look. Mac examined the part, grateful for something concrete to focus on. The casting numbers were wrong. This was from a '71 model, probably swapped in by some shade tree mechanic years ago. Normally, he'd explain the discrepancy and send Tommy away with the knowledge he needed. Instead, he found himself studying Tommy's face. The man was nervous, his usual easy smile strained around the edges. His eyes kept flicking toward the windows, and he'd positioned himself between Mac and the front door, blocking the exit rather than facing it. "How'd your customer describe the problem?" Mac asked, not touching the carburetor. "Said the engine was running rough, missing on acceleration." "Uh-huh." Mac stepped back from the workbench. "Funny thing about '69 Mustangs, Tommy. They came with Autolite carburetors as standard equipment. This here's a Carter AFB. Never would have been factory original." Tommy's smile faltered. "Yeah, well, you know how it is. People swap parts over the years." "Sure they do." Mac's hand drifted toward the drawer where he kept the .38. But a real parts guy would have spotted that casting number mismatch the minute he looked at it. "Which makes me wonder why you're really here." The pretense crumbled from Tommy's face like old paint. "They said you'd figure it out eventually. Said you were too smart for your own good. How long have they been paying you?" 3 years. Ever since that break-in you think was random." Tommy pulled a cell phone from his pocket, the first one Mac had ever seen him carry. "I'm supposed to call if you start acting erratic." Mac laughed, the sound harsh in the morning quiet. "Erratic? That what they're calling it? Mac, listen to me. These people, they're not playing games. Whatever Claire Morrison told you, whatever she's got you thinking about doing, it'll get people killed. Good people, innocent people. Like Jennifer Hoffman? Like her daughter?" Tommy's face went pale. "How do you—" He stopped himself, understanding flooding his features. "Jesus, Mac, they showed you the photos. Your bosses have been busy." "They're not my bosses, they're—" Tommy struggled for words. "They're a force of nature. You don't fight the ocean, Mac. You don't fight the wind. You survive them." But Mac was already moving, crossing to his office safe and spinning the combination. Inside, wrapped in an oil-stained cloth, was everything he'd saved from that night in Malibu Canyon. Evidence Harold Nile thought was destroyed decades ago. Tommy's phone was already at his ear when Mac turned around, and Mac knew his 3 years of borrowed peace were finally over. Tommy's finger hesitated over the phone's dial button, his eyes fixed on the oil-stained bundle in Mac's hands. "Don't make me do this, Mac, please." "You already did it." Mac unwrapped the cloth slowly, revealing a small cassette recorder, the kind journalists used in the '70s. 3 years of friendship. 3 years of coffee and bullshit about carburetors. How much did they pay you for all that performance? It wasn't performance, not all of it. Tommy's voice cracked. "I needed the money. Sophia's medical bills after the accident." "Rosa's Sophia?" "My niece. Rosa's my sister, Mac. The seizure disorder, the experimental treatments in Los Angeles. Insurance wouldn't cover half of it." Tommy's hand shook around the phone. They knew exactly what buttons to push. The revelation hit Mac like a punch to the solar plexus. Rosa's kindness, her morning coffee ritual, her easy friendship, all of it orchestrated by handlers who'd mapped every relationship in his life. Even his few moments of genuine human connection had been contaminated by their surveillance. "Rosa doesn't know," Tommy said quickly, reading Mac's expression. "She thinks I got a loan from the bank. She doesn't know about any of this." Mac turned the cassette recorder over in his hands. The plastic was yellowed with age, held together with electrical tape, but the recording mechanism still felt solid. Inside was 40 minutes of conversation between Steve McQueen and Harold Nile, recorded the morning after that night in Malibu Canyon. Steve's voice, raw with guilt and cocaine paranoia, confessing to things that would have destroyed more than just his career. "You know what's on this tape, Tommy? I know enough to understand you should put it back in that safe and pretend this conversation never happened." Instead, Mac walked to his old boombox and slotted the cassette into place. His finger hovered over the play button. Steve McQueen talking about the night Jennifer Walsh died, about who really killed her, about which studio executives knew the truth and why they needed a fall guy. Mac, about the snuff films they were making in Laurel Canyon, about the politicians and producers who were buying those films, about the network that went all the way up to— Tommy lunged forward, but Mac had already pressed play. Steve's voice filled the garage, younger but unmistakably him, thick with exhaustion and whatever drugs he'd been using to cope. Wasn't supposed to happen like that, Harold. The girl was supposed to stay quiet, take the money. But she started screaming about the camera, about what she'd seen them do to her friend. And Polanski, Jesus, Harold, what Polanski did to her. Tommy's phone clattered to the concrete floor. On the tape, Harold Nail's voice cut through Steve's rambling. None of that matters now. The Mackenzie boy will take the fall. He's expendable. You're not. Danny's my friend. He's got a family. Had a family. By tomorrow he'll be yesterday's news. Hollywood's full of stuntmen, Steve. There's only one you. Mac stopped the tape. The silence that followed felt heavier than sound, weighted with 54 years of buried truth. Tommy stood frozen by the workbench, his face the color of old concrete. That's why they killed him, Mac said quietly. Not because of the cancer, because he finally grew a conscience. You can't prove any of this. That tape, anyone could claim it's fake doctored. Maybe. But combined with Claire Morrison's testimony, the documentary evidence, the witnesses who are still alive, Mac ejected the cassette and held it up to the light streaming through the garage windows. This becomes very interesting to federal prosecutors. Tommy reached for his phone, but his movements were mechanical, defeated. They'll know something's wrong if I don't check in. Then check in. Tell them I'm acting erratic. Tell them I found the tape and I'm planning something stupid. Mac wrapped the cassette back in its cloth. Tell them whatever keeps Rosa safe. What about you? Mac looked around his garage one last time, at the movie posters that had become tombstones, at the shrine to a friendship that had cost him everything. For 54 years he'd preserved Steve McQueen's secret like a sacred relic. Now he understood it had always been a curse. I'm done hiding, Tommy. As if summoned by his words, a black sedan pulled into the alley behind the garage. Through the security monitors, Mac could see two figures stepping out, Harold Neal and another man he didn't recognize. They moved with the unhurried confidence of people who'd done this many times before. Tommy saw them too. His phone was suddenly at his ear, but no longer to make a call. They're here, Mac. Whatever you're planning to do. I'm planning to tell the truth. Mac slipped the cassette into his jacket pocket. Something I should have done 54 years ago. The sound of dress shoes on concrete echoed from the front of the garage. Harold Nail's voice carried through the morning air, calm and conversational. Mr. Mackenzie? I think it's time we finished our discussion. Mac's hand found the .38 in his desk drawer, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. It had never been about the gun. It had always been about the courage to use his voice. Mac stepped toward the front of the garage, the .38 heavy in his hand but useless against the weight of 5 decades. Harold Neal stood framed in the doorway like a movie villain, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, his silver hair catching the morning light. The man beside him was younger, broader, muscle disguised in an expensive suit. Put the gun down, Danny. We both know you're not going to use it. Mac kept the weapon raised, though his hands trembled with something deeper than fear. Maybe not. But I'm done taking orders from you. Harold stepped into the garage with the casual confidence of someone who owned every room he entered. His eyes swept over the scattered coffee stains, the movie posters, the shrine to a dead friendship. 54 years, and you still live like a monk, still punishing yourself for sins that were never yours to bear. Jennifer Walsh is dead because of what you made me cover up. Jennifer Walsh is dead because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong people. Harold's voice carried the patience of a teacher explaining simple concepts to a slow child. You think this is about one girl? One night in Malibu? Behind Mac, Tommy had gone completely still, his phone forgotten in his hand. The younger man by Harold's side shifted his weight, hand moving toward his jacket, but Harold waved him off with barely a glance. Tell me something, Danny. In all these years of self-flagellation, did you ever wonder why Steve McQueen really called you that night? Mac's grip tightened on the .38. I know why. He was scared, high, needed someone to help him think straight. Steve McQueen was many things, but he was never stupid, and he was never loyal enough to risk his career for a stuntman. Harold moved closer, his polished shoes crunching on broken ceramic. "He called you because I told him to call you." The words hit Mac like a physical blow. The garage seemed to tilt around him, 54 years of carefully constructed truth crumbling in real time. That's impossible. Is it? Think about it, Danny. Really think. Steve was spiraling, yes, but when had that ever stopped him before? The drugs, the women, the reckless behavior. We'd cleaned up dozens of his messes. Why would this time be different? Mac's mind raced backward through that night, searching for details he'd buried under decades of guilt. Steve's phone call hadn't been panicked. It had been rehearsed. The way he'd insisted Mac come alone, the specific things he'd said about needing someone he could trust, even the location where they'd met, a diner far from Steve's usual haunts. "The plan was always to sacrifice you," Harold continued, his voice gentle as a confession. "We needed someone with access to Steve, someone who cared enough about him to take the fall willingly, someone whose word would carry weight with investigators but who was ultimately disposable." Tommy made a sound behind Mac, part gasp, part moan. On the security monitor, Mac could see Rosa's car turning into the front parking lot, right on schedule for her morning shift. Steve knew? Mac's voice came out as a whisper. Steve knew he was in over his head. The parties in Laurel Canyon, the films being made there, the network of politicians and producers who were buying those films. It was bigger than Hollywood, Danny. It was bigger than any one man's career. Harold paused at the workbench, running his finger along its edge like he was checking for dust. When Jennifer Walsh threatened to expose what she'd witnessed, we gave Steve a choice: sacrifice his friend or sacrifice everything he'd built. The .38 felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Mac thought about the cassette in his pocket, Steve's voice confessing guilt and anguish over betraying his friend. But had it been guilt or had it been performance? The tape, Mac said. His confession, insurance. We needed Steve to believe he'd made the choice himself, that he was complicit in your downfall. Guilty people are easier to control than innocent ones. Harold's smile was the coldest thing Mac had ever seen. He recorded that confession, thinking it would protect you somehow, give him leverage if we ever went too far. He never understood that we already had all the leverage we needed. Rosa's footsteps echoed across the parking lot, her keys jingling as she approached the front door. In a few seconds, she'd walk into the middle of this, another innocent life caught in the crossfire of Mac's past. Steve McQueen died believing he'd betrayed his best friend to save his career, Harold said. The cancer was real, but it was also convenient. A natural death, a Hollywood legend's tragic end. So much cleaner than explaining why a beloved icon might suddenly develop a conscience about 50-year-old murders. Mac's hand began to shake. The gun wavered in his grip as 54 years of self-hatred transformed into something far more dangerous. Rage at the man who'd orchestrated every moment of his suffering. "You smug bastard," Mac whispered. "You think you're untouchable." Harold straightened his cufflinks, supremely confident. "Danny, I've been managing Hollywood scandals since before you learned to drive. This is just Tuesday for me." "Then you've forgotten something important about stuntmen." Mac's voice steadied as Rosa's key turned in the front door. "We're expendable, which means we've got nothing left to lose." The front door chimed as Rosa stepped inside, her morning greeting dying on her lips when she saw the tableau before her. Mac with a gun trained on two strangers, Tommy frozen by the workbench like a statue, the air thick with decades of buried secrets finally clawing their way to the surface. "Mac?" Her voice was small, confused. "What's happening?" Harold turned toward her with the same predatory smile he'd worn for 54 years of manipulating lives. "Miss Valdez, right on time." "Rosa, get out," Mac said without taking his eyes off Harold. "Walk away and don't look back." But she didn't move. Mac could see her in his peripheral vision, taking in the scene with the sharp intelligence that had made her indispensable to his business. Her eyes found Tommy's stricken face, and something shifted in her expression. Not fear, but recognition. "Tommy?" she said quietly. "What did you do?" "I'm sorry, Rosa. Sophia's treatments. They said they'd pay for everything, and all I had to do was—" "Watch him," Harold finished. "Report on his habits, his visitors, his state of mind. Your uncle has been quite helpful these past 3 years." Rosa's hand went to her throat. fingers finding the small cross she always wore. Mac watched her process the betrayal, saw the moment she understood that her friendship with him had been built on surveillance and lies. The hurt that crossed her face was worse than any physical wound. "All this time," she whispered, "you've been spying on him?" "Protecting him," Tommy said desperately. "They said if I kept watch, made sure he didn't do anything stupid, they'd leave him alone. They said whatever you needed to hear." Mac cut him off. The 38 felt steadier now, his purpose crystallizing with each revelation, just like they always do. Harold checked his watch with theatrical patience. "This is all very touching, but Ms. Morrison's documentary airs in 6 hours. We need to resolve this situation before then." "Claire's still alive?" Rosa asked. For now, the younger man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone accustomed to violence. That could change depending on how cooperative everyone is here. Mac felt the last chains of his old life snapping. For 54 years, he'd carried Steve McQueen's secret like a sacred trust. He'd sacrificed his marriage, his relationship with his daughter, his entire future to protect a friend who had betrayed him from the very beginning. The weight of that realization should have crushed him, but instead it felt like liberation. "You want to know something funny, Harold?" Mac's voice was conversational now, almost pleasant. "All these years, I thought I was protecting Steve's memory. Thought I was honoring our friendship by keeping my mouth shut. And now? Now I realize I wasn't protecting Steve at all. I was protecting you." Mac pulled the cassette from his pocket with his free hand, holding it where everyone could see. "This tape? Steve wasn't confessing his guilt. He was documenting yours." Harold's composure cracked for the first time, his eyes fixed on the yellowed plastic. "That recording proves nothing. Steve was paranoid, drug-addled." "Steve was scared," Mac said. "Scared of what he'd gotten himself into, scared of what you'd made him do to me. So he started documenting everything. Every conversation, every threat, every time you reminded him that his career depended on my silence." Rosa stepped closer, and Mac could smell her perfume, the same jasmine scent that had brightened his mornings for 3 years. "Is that why they've been watching you? Because of what's on that tape?" "The tape's just the beginning," Mac said. "Steve kept records, Rosa. Names, dates, photographs. He knew he was in over his head, and he knew they'd eventually come for him, so he made sure there'd be evidence." The younger man's hand moved toward his jacket again, but Mac swung the 38 in his direction. "I wouldn't. We're way past the point where you can clean this up quietly." "Are we?" Harold's voice regained its oily confidence. "Because from where I stand, I see a mentally unstable man having a breakdown, threatening innocent people with a gun, making wild accusations about events that happened decades ago." He gestured toward the security cameras Mac had installed. "Your own equipment will corroborate our version of events." Mac looked up at the cameras he'd thought would protect him, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "You've been controlling the feeds for 3 years. Every conversation, every visitor, every moment of your sad little life, all documented and edited to support whatever narrative we need." Harold's smile returned full force. "Did you really think we'd let you install surveillance equipment without ensuring it served our purposes?" But Mac was already moving, crossing to his workbench where the old boombox sat. He slotted the cassette into place and turned the volume up full. Steve McQueen's voice filled the garage once more, but this time Mac let it play past the confession, past Harold's cold manipulation, to the part he'd never had the courage to hear before. Steve's voice, clear and determined. "Danny, if something happens to me, if they decide I've become a liability, everything's hidden where we used to go as kids. You'll know the place. You'll know what to do." The cassette clicked off. In the sudden silence, Mac could hear Rosa's sharp intake of breath, Tommy's whispered prayer, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of approaching sirens. Harold's face went ashen as the sirens grew louder. "Those aren't our people." Mac smiled for the first time in years, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered features. "No, they're not." He kept the 38, trained on Harold while reaching into his back pocket. "Rosa, remember last week when you asked why I kept going to that old diner on Route 99? The one with terrible coffee? Rosa nodded, her eyes wide but alert. She was putting pieces together faster than Harold's men could react. I wasn't going for the coffee. I was going to make copies. Mac pulled out a small digital recorder, its red light blinking steadily. Every conversation in this garage for the past month, every threat, every admission. He looked directly at Tommy. Every report you made to your handlers. Tommy's legs gave out, and he collapsed onto a workbench stool. Jesus, Mac. Jesus Christ. The diner owner is married to a retired FBI agent, Mac continued, his voice growing stronger as the sirens approached. Funny thing about federal agents, they never really retire, and they have very little patience for 50-year-old cover-ups involving murdered young women. Harold's composure finally shattered completely. You have no idea what you're dealing with. The network that protected those people, that protected Steve, it's bigger than you can imagine. Judges, senators, studio heads. I know exactly what I'm dealing with, Mac interrupted. I've been living with it for 54 years. The garage filled with flashing red and blue light as multiple vehicles pulled into the parking lot. The difference is, I'm done being afraid of it. The younger man made his move then, hand diving for his weapon, but Mac had spent decades coordinating stunts that required split-second timing. The .38 barked once, the bullet taking the man in the shoulder and spinning him against a tool cabinet. He went down hard, his gun skittering across the concrete. Harold raised his hands, but his eyes burned with pure hatred. You think this ends it? You think arresting me stops anything? No, Mac said quietly, ejecting the cassette from the boombox as federal agents poured through both entrances of the garage. But it starts something. Steve understood that, even at the end. That's why he left me the map to find his evidence cache. Rosa moved to Mac's side as FBI agents surrounded Harold and his wounded associate. Where we used to go as kids, she said, understanding. You figured it out. Mac nodded. Steve and I used to race motorcycles in the hills above Malibu when we were young and stupid. There's an old mining cave up there, hidden in the rocks. He always said it was the perfect place to bury treasure. He looked at Harold, who was being handcuffed with professional efficiency. Turns out he was right. Agent Sarah Chen, the FBI contact Mac had been working with for 3 weeks, approached with her badge visible. Mr. Mackenzie, we'll need you to come with us for a full debriefing. I know. Mac set the .38 carefully on his workbench. Agent Chen, this is Rosa Valdez and Tommy Herrera. Rosa's been helping me piece together my memories. Tommy... Mac looked at his old friend with something that might have been forgiveness. Tommy's been caught between 2 impossible choices. Tommy looked up from his hands, tears streaming down his face. Sophia's treatments will continue, Agent Chen said firmly. The Bureau has victim assistance programs for situations like this. You're not the first person to be leveraged through a loved one's medical needs. As Harold was led past them toward the exit, he stopped and looked directly at Mac. You could have lived quietly, could have taken your secrets to the grave like a gentleman. Mac met his gaze without flinching. Steve McQueen wasn't just an actor, Harold. He was my friend. And friends don't let friends die believing they're monsters. He paused. Even when they've made terrible mistakes, they deserve the truth. The garage felt different as the last of the federal agents filed out, lighter somehow, as if decades of accumulated secrets had been physically removed from the air. Rosa touched Mac's arm gently. What happens now? Mac looked around at his shrine to the past, the movie posters, the photographs, the carefully preserved memories of a friendship he'd finally learned to see clearly. Now we tell the truth, all of it, and we let Steve McQueen finally rest in peace. Through the window, Mac could see Claire Morrison's documentary crew setting up across the street, ready to capture whatever came next. For the first time in 54 years, Mac felt ready to face the cameras. The past was finally in the past. The truth would speak for itself. 3 months later, Mac stood in the morning light streaming through his garage windows. But everything had changed. The walls were bare now. No movie posters, no photographs of him and Steve in younger days, no shrine to a friendship built on lies. Instead, there were new things. A letter from his daughter Sarah, postmarked from Portland, asking if she could visit. A thank you card from Jennifer Walsh's sister, who'd finally gotten answers about what happened that night in Malibu. A newspaper clipping about Harold Morrison's conviction, buried on page 6 like an afterthought. The documentary had aired to massive ratings and endless controversy. The McQueen deception, a Hollywood cover-up, had sparked congressional hearings and FBI investigations that were still unfolding. Some defended Steve's legacy, claiming Mac was a bitter has-been seeking attention. Others hailed him as a hero for exposing decades of corruption. Mac found he didn't care much about either reaction. What mattered was the quiet. Rosa arrived for work at exactly 8:30, same as always, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the good place downtown instead of the swill from the convenience store. She'd stayed through everything: the media circus, the federal depositions, the painful process of rebuilding trust after Tommy's betrayal. Her loyalty hadn't wavered, even when reporters offered her money for exclusive interviews about the man who knew McQueen's secret. "Morning, Mac." She set his coffee on the cleaned workbench, now clear of Steve's cassette player and the weight of hidden truths. "Mrs. Patterson's Honda is ready for pickup. And that journalist from Rolling Stone called again. Tell him what I told the others." Mac sipped his coffee, tasting something he'd almost forgotten: peace. "I said everything I needed to say." Tommy had been granted immunity in exchange for his testimony about the surveillance network. His niece Sophia was in remission, her medical bills covered by the Victim Assistance Program Agent Chen had promised. He'd moved to Phoenix with his family, unable to meet Mac's eyes during their final conversation. Mac understood. Some bridges once broken couldn't be rebuilt, only mourned and left behind. The garage door chimed, and Claire Morrison entered. Not the filmmaker who'd ambushed him months ago, but a different woman entirely. Harder, sadder, carrying the weight of exposing truths that had destroyed lives as well as delivered justice. Mac. She nodded to Rosa, who'd become protective of him in the aftermath. "I wanted to stop by before I headed back to New York. How's Harold?" Mac asked, not looking up from the engine he was rebuilding. 25 to life. No parole. Claire's voice carried no satisfaction, only exhaustion. His network is still unraveling. 3 more arrests last week, including a former studio head. Mac nodded. Justice felt different than he'd imagined. Less triumphant, more like a debt finally paid in full. And Jennifer's family? "Getting closure, I think," her sister said, knowing the truth was worth the wait, even after 54 years. Claire paused. "There's something else. We found Steve's evidence cache yesterday." Mac's hands stilled on the wrench. Agent Chen had been excavating the old mining cave for weeks, following Steve's cryptic clues from the cassette. And? Film reels. Hundreds of them. Documentation of everything Harold was running: the parties, the trafficking, the blackmail network. Steve had been secretly recording for years, building a case he never got to use. Claire's voice softened. "There was also a letter addressed to you." She pulled an envelope from her jacket, yellowed with age but still sealed. Mac's name was written across it in Steve's familiar scrawl, along with a date, December 1980, just weeks before Steve's diagnosis. Mac took the letter with hands that only trembled slightly. "What does it say?" "I don't know. It was sealed." Claire met his eyes. "That one wasn't evidence, Mac. It was meant for you." After Claire left, Mac sat alone in his office, the envelope unopened on his desk. Rosa had gone to lunch, giving him space for whatever this moment required. Through the window, he could see Bakersfield going about its ordinary business. People pumping gas, kids riding bikes, life continuing in all its mundane beauty. He opened the letter carefully, Steve's voice echoing across 43 years. "Danny, if you're reading this, then you've figured out my clues and the bastards are finally getting what they deserve. I know what I did to you. I know what I cost you. I told myself it was necessary, that sacrificing one friend was worth protecting the industry, but that was just cowardice dressed up as nobility. You deserved better. You deserve the truth. I hope someday I can give it to you. If I can't, if they get me first, then know this: everything I did after that night was an attempt to make it right. Every recording, every piece of evidence I gathered, it was all for you. My friend, my brother, the only person in this town who ever loved me for who I was instead of what I could do for them. Find peace, Danny. You've earned it. Steve, Mac folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, next to the garage's deed and Rose's employment contract and all the other documents that defined his real life, the one he'd built from nothing after losing everything. The afternoon sun slanted through the garage windows, warming his face as he returned to work. For the first time in 54 years, Mackenzie felt like himself again.